Right, hello, greetings. It's Thomas Daffern here. It's my weekly talk, recorded for anyone that wants to, tune in to the Archdruid of Europe on the peace front. And there's so much going on in the world since I started this weekly fast for peace and common sense that it seems that, a lot of work to be done, really. And I'm recording this on the 5th of July, the day after Independence Day, and the anniversary of the death of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams on the same day, by synchronistically. So I'm going to be doing a sort of overview of some of my studies that I've been doing this week as a scholar, historian and so on, and their relevance really for contemporary events. I'm constantly writing and researching, and I keep finding these strange synchronicities between what I'm working on and events in the real world. And I want to start with that. I want to start with a tragic event that's largely lost to history, actually. I'm a historian, so I'm speaking now with my history hat on. As a scholar of history, I did my degree in history at the University of London. I did a PhD there. I taught there for many years. And I taught at the University of Oxford. And, I'm in love with history. I'm a historian. But in my thesis, I argued, and subsequent works, that we need to develop a new kind of history. Conventional history, which is the kind mostly taught in universities, isn't equipping us to deal with the complexity of what's going on in the world at the moment. We're in a sort of primitive understanding of history, and when I was taught, I think my best teachers are more sophisticated, but there are still some old history buffs that teach events as if they're all like billiard balls, just knocking around on a flat billiard table of events, and they're all separate from each other, and there's this knock there that knocks that event off there and there. So they're working with a very monocausal definition of events, and they're operating in a Newtonian universe in which, billiard ball A is totally separate from billiard ball B, and they bash into each other and something happens. This was a product of 19th century materialism, this concept in history. And at the time, people thought, this is great, really sophisticated, we're doing materialist history. But I think now we need a much more sophisticated understanding, because the human mind, the intellect, the soul, the emotions, the feelings, are part of history. So along comes this new school called psychohistory. Lloyd de Maus and others pioneered the idea, well, hey, why don't we put feelings into history? What about the psyche? What about the unconscious? Maybe Bismarck and Hitler and stuff were operating out of unconscious drives. Maybe the fact that Hitler was part Jewish was partly self-loathing, that he was therefore trying to do Holocaust because he really hated himself, kind of stuff. That's psychohistory. And it's interesting, and they've got a great literature and lineage. And other historians came along and developed and finessed that. Robert J. Lifton was one of those who looked at, he wrote many famous books, one called The Nazi Doctors, looking at how these Nazi scientists, medical doctors, could have actually done experiments on living people in Auschwitz and places, and what was going on in their minds to justify this. He was a psychohistorian looking at the dark side of human nature, and a great intellectual. I came along and I took on board the ideas of transpersonal psychology, which by and large psychohistorians have neglected and ignored. I think they're still operating from a largely billiard ball model, even of the psyche. Freud had a sort of reductionist, materialist view of the psyche that it can be analysed scientifically, as in, by which he meant energetically in a lab somewhere, you'd be able to look at the emotions if only we had a detailed enough brain scanning equipment and could study the the details of it all. I mean, his therapeutic stuff was therefore a bit simplistic. For instance, Prince Philip's mother, who was an amazing woman, she was the Queen of Greece. And, I met Prince Philip, not for long, we had a little chat, but he's a great man, I think, Philip. He's now 99, for God's sake. When I met him about 20 years ago, he was still, relatively young and sprightly, but his mother was a tragic case. Princess Alexandra, I think she was called. And she was very religious. She was diagnosed with a malady. And the medical scientists at the time, the psychiatrists, eventually took her to Freud because he was the expert. And she was in a sanatorium and so on. She was having religious delusions. Well, that's what they call them, religious delusions. I think if she'd have ended up with Jung, it might have been a better treatment. What Freud did was he diagnosed hypersexuality. She was too sexually active. Therefore, he said you've got to zap her, ovary area, female, genitalia, etc., with X-rays, like kill that hypersexuality. And literally, the sanatorium where I think it was Switzerland, zapped her with X-rays for a course of treatment. I mean, come on, that's Freud, right? How simplistic is that? Poor woman, she survived. She eventually got out, and she, carried on into old age. She founded an order of nuns, bless her, in Athens, which worked a lot with interfaith refugees. She helped Jews fleeing from the Nazis when the Nazis invaded Athens. And she, at her request, she's buried in the church of Mary Magdalene opposite the Golden Gate in Jerusalem, which I've been to. She was an amazing woman. That's just a little aside to tell you how simplistic Freud's theories were, really. Although he was obviously a genius, and but he was dated according to his time. Jung, I think, was on a much different level. He was more sophisticated, and since then, transpersonal psychology has become much, much more sophisticated with people like Abraham Maslow and, Ken Wilber and all the great kind of trans-dimensional theorists like Jean Gebser or Aurobindo, because also transpersonal psychology draws on other spiritual lineages, not just Western, academic science, but also Indian, Chinese, indigenous thought and so on. So I propose that we need a transpersonal history which will bring back the richness. It'll put the colour on the history that we have. I mean, the history we're taught mainly in schools and universities is monochrome. It's like this king, that emperor, this prime minister, that act. The history I was taught at school in Brighton was, it was hard to make it come alive because it's all memories of facts. And I mean, in fact, because of my father and I had some very good teachers, and because I did ancient history for A-level, I got to the point where it was in 3D Technicolor. But so my proposal anyway is that transpersonal history looks at the history of the soul, the mind, the psyche, in its own terms of reference, not as an epiphenomena of your glands, which was 19th century theories, but as an aspect or manifestation of the world soul, of the cosmic mind, to use the Buddhist term, the alaya vijnana. In Yogacara Buddhism, my unconscious and your unconscious, we're plugged into one collective unconscious, the alaya vijnana, the storehouse of all possible knowledges. And this is what Jung was exploring, the idea of the collective unconscious. So to explore that in history, suddenly it's like, Technicolor comes on. A wonderful chap has written a book on dreaming in history, which is an example of that work. And he's written some very sophisticated, looking back over history, who were the great, there are times in history where the whole of the future of the world depends on somebody's having a dream. Think of Joseph, the father of Jesus, husband of the Virgin Mary, and having these precognitive dreams that, hey, we better get baby Jesus out of Bethlehem, there's trouble coming. Takes him down to Egypt, and Jesus survives. Well, there's an example of an epochal dream. There are others, like Joseph dreaming in Egypt and so on. So this chap, Robert Moss, has written The Secret History of Dreaming. It's a masterpiece, looking at that. That's an example of what I call transpersonal history. And he gives examples, I think people like Joan of Arc with their dreams and so on. So so that's the theory, transpersonal history, right? And I could go on about that for days, but I'll spare you you can read my books, read my thesis. And I want to home in on just 1 year, because if this methodology works, it can apply to any moment or epoch in history. It can apply to our time now that we're living through, which it does, but it can also apply to any moment in the past. I want to briefly look at 1527. Now, that's not a year that immediately jumps out as, oh yeah, that's the Battle of Hastings, 1066. No. What happened in 1527? Well, if you're a European historian, as I am, I studied European history for my degree in enormous detail. We know that it's the year of the sack of Rome. Oh, what's that? What happened? Most people haven't got a clue. Why is that important? Right. So the sack of Rome was cataclysmic, and I just want to. I'm bringing it to your attention as an example of lost history. It was fundamentally the end of the Renaissance. Now, we all know the Italian Renaissance. If you're lucky like me, you've been to the Warburg Institute, part of the University of London, you've sat there and you've just ogled at all the incredible resources that the Warburg Institute has of Renaissance art and poetry and literature and so on. But it survived with a hair's breadth, the sack of Rome. Up until 1527, Rome was an amazing, incredible place, and the whole Italian peninsula, Florence, etc., synthesizing ancient wisdom, the recovered Platonic works of Greece, the works that the humanists were translating from ancient Greek into Latin and making available to everybody, including scientific works, and also the pagan works of ancient Alexandra, the Hermetic texts, suddenly were being made available to scholars, to study in detail. And it was mind-blowing to these scholars when I went to the Vatican Library in Rome, which fortunately survived the sack, I'll explain that in a minute, I was fascinated to see that on the open shelves of the Vatican Library, which I have a reader's ticket to, I would say without a doubt the most thumbed book was the 3-volume set of the Hermetic texts. It's still, dynamite. I mean, all the great fathers of the church, the Clements of Alexandra and so on, they're all there. But the one everybody's reading is the Hermetic texts. And it was the same in 1527. The library was there, people were studying away, and there was this sense, I think, the New World had just been discovered, Columbus, etc., and I should say rediscovered. And there was this sense of the infinite regress of potential knowledge. Brunelleschi had built his dome in Florence, and perspective had been discovered for art. There was this sense of we can now go to the vanishing point. All the world can be, understood. Because the Italian Renaissance was a rational project, and Leonardo was working away. The great artists of the Renaissance had been active. The world is fundamentally rational, and it is good, it is divine, and it is shot through and infused with this divinity, and it is the duty of the scholar to make manifest that beauty, that divinity. That's what Leonardo was doing with his very, very detailed analysis of everything from the flight of a hummingbird to, the fall of a wave, to the way a woman's hair curls, etc. It was his love of beauty, the beauty of nature. There's a wonderful quote by Poincaré, a great French mathematician, actually, who said that the reason to study nature, the reason for science, is because nature is beautiful. That's why we study it. So that is in that Renaissance tradition. The French have never quite forgotten this, it seems to me. I think something went wrong with the transmission to the Royal Society in the English when they cut off all possible metaphysical reflections on nature and just reduce it to mathematical experimentation, which is, I mean, come on, like, you're a lover, you're meeting your beloved, you're going to her boudoir, it's night, you've got a candle, you're dressed in beautiful clothes, she's exquisite on the bed. What do? Take out your measuring rod, your tape measure, start measuring the temperature of her body? No, you love it. I mean, it's as if, you see, true science begins with that space of wonder and love, in my opinion, and also Poincaré's. And that was all in Rome, that was what these amazing savants knew. And I want to talk about one of them in particular. I want to talk about Cardinal Egidio de Viterbo, who was just exemplifies that school of Renaissance Christianity that was active in Rome. And so few people really know this. It's not taught in our schools. The wonder of that time has been, suppressed, actually, the knowledge of that. I mean, we all love the pictures. We all go and watch Raphael's paintings and Leonardo and Michelangelo. Tourists go to the Sistine Chapel and, take some photos. But what's not taught or understood is the depth of thought behind all that made it possible. Anyway, this cardinal was an amazing guy. Came from Viterbo, which was a great city not far from Rome, a bit north, with ancient Etruscan roots. And he was a scholar. He became the head of the Augustinian order, which he ran as their prior general from 1507 to 1518. And when the young man like Martin Luther came, a monk of the Augustinian order, to Rome, he had an audience with Cardinal Egidio de Viterbo. And if I live long enough, I'm going to write a play about their audience, the day of their meeting. Because so much was at stake, because here was this rather peasant-like chap with a few good ideas, Luther, clever chap, professor, but he had huge blind sides, and one of them was his anti-Semitism. He just did not get the importance of the Jews to Christianity. He didn't get why we should know about them. He thought, no, they're accursed people, they lost, let's just get rid of them. And they've got too much money, etc. Whereas the Egidio de Viterbo was deeply, deeply studying not just Judaism, but the Jewish Kabbalah, the esoteric, the heart, the core of Judaism. And he was translating the Zohar into Latin. He had staff in his house in Rome working on these translations for him, experts in Kabbalah. And he was trying to put a synthesis together in his own writings of Jewish Kabbalah, Christian esotericism, plus universal spirituality, the ancient wisdom traditions, Hermeticism and so on. And he argued that, all wisdom comes from ultimately the common source. For the Jewish people, it comes down orally as the Kabbalah. In writing, it's the Bible that we know. But the Bible doesn't make sense unless you have the key, which is in the Kabbalah alone. And he knew that because he'd actually read the Zohar, he'd read the Sefer Yetzirah, which gave the key. And the key, the Kabbalah is very complicated. I'm not going to go into that whole thing here, but just study it and you'll realize that most studies of the Old Testament, biblical studies, are just like skin deep. They don't penetrate to what this thing, the Kabbalah, is. The word Kabbalah simply means receiving. Facings. It's the same root as the Arabic word, the Qibla, which is when you face the direction of Mecca. So the Kabbalah is when you face the ultimate truth. And I've written about it. You can read some of my books on it. But Egidio was one of those savants then who was working away on it with the full blessing and support of the papacy. I mean, because they were learned people. They were scholars in their own right, and the Pope at the time of the tragedy that I'm about to relate, the 1527 sack, was a Medici, and he was a great savant from the Medici family, and he was a friend of and supporting Cardinal Viterbo, Clement VII. Okay, so. And there were he had this huge library, and so did so many other scholars in Rome at that time they were working as a think tank on ultimate truth. Now, so what happened? What went wrong? Well, an army turned up, nominally working for the Emperor Charles V, who was becoming far too mighty and too powerful. He was uniting the Habsburg Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, with Spain. He was creating this sort of world state. And he wasn't really up to the job. He wasn't intellectually deep enough. He wasn't ethically, enlightened enough. Sadly, I have to say that, for that job. And he had this army. He decided to attack Italy and to attack Rome. And he'd sent a French mercenary chap, Bourbon, down across the Alps to attack Italy, which, this is why I'm against war. War is a very murderous business, and it may start out like a good idea. Hitler might have thought, well, I tell you what, we'll invade the Soviet Union. We don't like them. We'll launch Operation Barbarossa. Turned into the greatest mass slaughter ever known in human history, and the most barbarous war fought by the Germans with no adherence to rules or the Geneva Convention, and it facilitated and enabled their mass slaughter of the Jewish people of the Soviet Union and Poland. Obviously, they'd invaded Poland before in 1939, but so this army descending on Rome was essentially largely a German army, and a lot of them, many were Catholic, loyal to the Emperor Charles V, who was supposed to be a Catholic, right? So here's a Catholic army, Emperor's army, attacking the Pope. I mean, of course it makes no sense. War is illogical. Also in that army were many people who were inspired by Luther's rebellion against the papacy. Now, unfortunately, when Luther left Rome and left his audience with the cardinal, he went back sort of jealous, hating, full of spite, hating the Jews, hating, everything he saw in Rome. It was too much art, too many naked pictures of women type stuff, it's all the devil's work. He had a very simplistic peasant view of good and evil, in my opinion. He thought literally the devil was, attacking him when he was sitting on the loo kind of stuff. I mean, he was neurotic, and Erik Erikson, another great psychohistorian, has written a very good book, Young Man Luther, about his neuroses and so on. So this army was full of these kind of types, all saying, and they were looking forward to sacking Rome because, they'd been brainwashed by Lutheranism that the Pope was evil, all this stuff was wicked. Now this isn't, okay, so to me it's a tragedy, and I'm speaking as someone that is a Protestant Catholic. I'm a Universalist, and I also protest against injustice. This catastrophe that I'm about to tell you was that. It was a catastrophe. And if only, the angels could have intervened somehow, it wasn't to be, it happened. This army of angry, sort of disgruntled military types turned up outside Rome, camped there, demanded the surrender of the city under the Duke de Bourbon. And the papal guard was not very big. It didn't have many defenders. Rome was a walled city, so they hoped they could keep this army out on the walls. They had people lined up, with arquebuses, like ungainly kind of gunpowder gun type things that you could fire like rifles, but not very accurate. And a battle started between the arquebuses in the Emperor's army, aiming up at the walls and the people on the walls, and that went on for a bit. The demand for surrender was refused, and so the next day, I think that was a draw, and then the next day, the imperial forces then had a plan to attack several points of the walls, including they were going to do two fake attacks on these parts of the walls, and the main one would be at the weakest point of the walls, where the walls were the lowest, into a garden area. And they got over, and they got in, and they swarmed in because they had like, you know, ladders and all that kind of thing. And then they started massacring. The general in charge of this assault, Bourbon, Frenchman, who was not a particularly nice man, to put it mildly, he'd fallen out with the king, Francis, who was a good man and the patron of Leonardo, and was a cultured man. He would have never let this happen. Bourbon was dead, so the army literally had no commander. They were just like wild rampaging force that started going through the streets of Rome, killing people and destroying, you know, everything they could find. And the sack of Rome was literally that. For a couple of weeks, they were unleashed on the street and the population was massacred. Now, we're not talking just like, yeah, I mean, it was massacred cruelly, viciously, and horribly. There were rapes, there were disembowelments, there were all kinds of tortures going on. We know because we have lots of eyewitness accounts of this catastrophe, and we have one of the greatest historians of modern history, a man called Guicciardini, who was Florentine, was a witness to it all, and he knew, he saw what was going on. And he was a friend of Machiavelli in Florence, and they were both appalled, absolutely shocked. Guicciardini saw what was happening. He was too late to stop it. He wasn't actually in Rome at the time of the actual siege, but he arrived soon after. And he then wrote a history of Italy. He was so shocked by what he'd seen. So what was going on? Well, Rome was full of scholars and savants, and their works were trashed by this mob. So Cardinal Egidio de Viterbo's library was burned, destroyed, trashed. His staff, his people, just had to flee. He himself escaped with his life, just. Others weren't so lucky. And there's a whole, I mean, if you study the history of this, I mean, for instance, Paolo Bombace, who was a great Greek scholar, you know, fluent in Greek, and was a teacher of Erasmus and a great friend of Erasmus, the most learned humanist of north of the Alps in those days. He was killed during the sack. I mean, just slaughtered, right? People of that quality. People who'd been friends and colleagues of Raphael, the great painter. Raphael died in 1520, so he didn't live to witness this. He died young at the age of, I think, 37, so he might well have, or 34 even. He might have lived, and he might have been killed in this horrendous assault. But a lot of his friends and students and protégés were killed, massacred. And if you search it, Fabio Calvo, another great scholar who had translated Vitruvius, the expert on the history of architecture from ancient Rome, for Raphael, he was slaughtered, hacked down by this mob. Raphael had died, in 1520, and his love of beauty, Raphael's paintings are just exquisite in my opinion. They symbolize everything that this Roman Renaissance stood for, the Italian Renaissance. He had a great love of his life. He had many loves, but the one that he was most faithful to, a woman called Margherita Luti, had the nickname La Fornarina. She was his mistress. They never actually got married because the Pope was dangling the possibility of Raphael becoming a cardinal. It was not, unknown for artists to become cardinals in those days. But he was faithful to his mistress. He loved her, and she, it was mutual. And he did a beautiful, beautiful painting of her, bare-breasted, which was, the custom of some noble women used to, dress up in their finery and show off their breasts. It was not seen as lewd or something to be ashamed of. Nowadays, it's incredible, isn't it? A woman breastfeeding their child in a restaurant will get spat on by thugs, what? The most sacred thing, the mother-child relationship, the thing that's in all churches all over the world, baby Jesus getting the suck from his mother, sacred thing, and we can't cope with that, we can't cope with the naked breast. To me, this symbolises the ignorance that we've fallen into as a culture. No wonder we're falling apart. So, all that beauty was being butchered to the sword. And so I utterly, I want to start with that, because to me it's a symbol of what I call Sophiaphobia. That army doing that sack symbolizes what I've identified in history as a transpersonal historian. I've identified there is this phenomenon that comes up in history. It's called Sophiaphobia. That army, they hated the beauty. They hated the freedom of the women. They hated the erotic art that they saw everywhere. They hated the intercultural amity between Jews and Christians. They hated the universality that Rome stood for. They hated the books that they had. And God, look, some of them were in Hebrew. Burn that one. Now that's ignorance. That's the ignorant thug and en masse, the mob. Now that's what Sophiaphobes do. They're people that fear wisdom, actually, deep down. Why do they fear wisdom? Well, read my book on Sophiaphobia. I think it's very complex. And I had this discussion with my friend and mentor, Dr. Zaki Badawi of the Muslim College, a great savant from the Islamic culture, but who was very learned in world history and culture, and graduate of Al-Azhar University in Cairo. And he said, the trouble with you Westerners is you're afraid of wisdom. Because it's in your Bible, it's in your holy book. Man fell through the knowledge of the apple. And therefore wisdom, we're all a bit suspicious of it, he said. Because if you're too wise, then, it must be the devil kind of thing. So I think a lot of these Luther types roaming around streets of Rome, killing these, intellectuals, they were doing so because they thought, well, they're all devil worshippers here in Rome. The popes are Satan, This is like, this is the default ignorance of the extreme Protestant wing of Sophiaphobia, which I don't buy into, I'm afraid. It's completely stark raving bonkers. But there's a sort of logic to it, because, a lot of these peasants were quite poor. They'd never probably seen more than 2 books in their life. And here they were in this city of marvels. And what were they going to do? Well, burn it down. It's obvious. It reminds me of the crowd in Hitler's day who were burning books, who were burning the Jews, and who were burning savants. Socialists, oh God, burn him, kill him off. Communists, what's that? That's some fancy Jewish thing, isn't it? Kill them. The response to intellectuals by the mob is to kill, destroy, and burn. And that's what this mob was doing in 1527. Now, I've identified in my book on Sophiaphobia, little instances when this happens in history. I've tried to analyse the dialectics of what causes it. And examples are the burning of John Dee's library in London. John Dee was a great lover of wisdom, a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, and the mob got his library and burned it, when he was away, in Europe, of course, meeting savants over here. And the mob hated Dee because they thought he was a black magician. Look, all these books on maths, what are all these figures and tables, what are these numbers here? Must be a black magician, burn them, the guy had a degree from Trinity College at Cambridge and was a great savant, but no, that's no good, burn it kind of thing. And it's lucky he survived with his life, actually. He was put in prison, suspected several times. And another example is Joseph Priestley, the great scholar, of the 18th century, who co-discovered oxygen, working down near Caen, where I used to teach at St Mary's School. And our girls' magazine was called Oxygen, in honour of Priestley, who identified oxygen just nearby in the grounds of a stately home